Welcome back to the last class on international business communication. It's been painful, it's been descriptive, we've covered a lot of ground. I may have missed certain things, and if that is the case, then I'm sorry. Do point it out and we'll fix it as soon as we get some feedback. But it's been an interesting journey for me. I hope it has been for you as well. I have tried to give you as many leads as possible regarding communication. I have emphasized this again and again, and I will continue to do so. The goal of this class was not to give you patchwork. The goal of this class was not to give you ready strategies. What I expect you to do at the end of this lecture or the series of lectures is to come up with your own strategies for dealing with different situations. You should be the one writing 10 steps to effective negotiation, 15 steps to effective conflict management, 20 steps to effective presentations, all of that stuff. You should be the one doing it. So I expect you to take the learning from these classes and develop your own systems and develop your own strategies for dealing with different situations in the international business environment. And that is why I've given you so much of theory, so much of different kinds of inputs from all over. If you look at the list of references, it runs into many pages, and I have really gone through all of that material and tried to pull out whatever I think will be applicable for you as a professional trying to function in the international business environment. Now in today's class, I will not give you more theory. I will not give you very much of new information. What I'll do is I will wrap up whatever we have covered. I will try and revise everything we have done. I'll go session wise, and we'll see if this will just give you a brief overview of whatever we have done in the past classes. So let's begin. Today's class is aptly titled The Conclusion. This is the last class, and we will go stage wise, and towards the end we'll see if we can sum up and come up with a strategy for what it means to be a global manager, what it means to be a manager in the international business environment. And that's what I hope this series of lectures will help you become. Okay. What we covered in session 1, we covered some concepts. We discussed why we communicate, what communication is, how does communication happen. We talked about Berlow's SMCR model. We talked about who communicates, the levels of communication. So SMCR stands for source, message, channel and receiver model, the role of context. We talked about the channels of communication. We talked about the utterance as a unit of communication. We also talked a little bit about the history of business communication. We discussed Squire's model. We discussed the functions, processes and contingencies in a manager's work and how they apply to communication by the manager in a business environment. Now you'll see when we revise, you'll see that things keep getting linked back. I was trying to go back and forth between the different concepts. You will see that highlighted in today's class as well. In the second session, we talked about culture. We defined culture. We discussed what inter and intra-cultural communication was. We discussed the complexities of culture, what it meant to be coming from different cultures. We also discussed a whole bunch of sources of difference, including age, gender, ethnicity, educational background, the system of education one might have gone through, the nationality, geographic boundaries, the community that one lived in, the language one spoke, so many things that make us different. Then why do we try and classify everything? Why do we try and categorize things? Why do we try and draw parallels? Why do we stereotype? And that is the question I would like you, the listeners, to answer. Please discuss amongst yourselves why we stereotype people when we are so different from each other. What is the purpose behind that? Why do we need strategies? Can we ever come up with strategies? Can we ever come up with a list of patches or a list of formulae to help us deal with different situations? I am not too sure of that. All I can do is heighten your sensitivity, which is what I've tried to do through these 40 lectures or 39 lectures, and today is the 40th one. We talked about international communication and how it differs from intercultural communication. We also talked about the significance of studying intercultural communication in the international business environment. In sessions 3 and 4, we discussed communicative competence. We talked about interpretive competence. In this, we talked about attribution theories, how we attribute the competence, where we think that the locus of control of competence is. Who decides who is a competent communicator? Who do we attribute the concept of competence or the trait of competence to? Is it you, the speaker, the sender of the message? Is it the receiver of the message? Is it clarity in the channel? So we discussed all of these different things. We also discussed the biases we have in the attribution of competence. When we interpret competence, how biases impact our interpretation of communication competence. We discussed communicative competence in the business environment. Please, thank you. We discussed what it means to be competent, communicatively competent in the business environment, who decides. We discussed context and competence. We discussed intercultural communication competence. We discussed the role of context in determining what it meant to be a competent communicator. We discussed intercultural communication competence in terms of appropriateness, effectiveness. We also discussed in great detail Spitzberg model of intercultural competence. So, in session 5, we talked about identity. We discussed what identity was, we discussed the definitions, we discussed identity and competence, we discussed what cultural identity is. What does identity mean to you? To you, it probably means how you look at yourself. To outsiders, it means what they see you as, and the difference between the two can create a conflict in your own minds. And when you go to a different culture, the expectations from you can create a conflict in this identity, in how you perceive yourself, how you think others perceive you, how you think others should perceive you, and that can create a conflict, and that can really create a problem for you, that can really put a burden on you, that can impact the way you communicate, that will impact the way you communicate, that will impact the way you behave, your verbal and non-verbal signals that you're sending out into the environment. So we discussed all of that. We also discussed the properties of identity, how the characteristics of identity, the constituents of identity. We discussed identity as a determinant of culture. Again, we talked about what it means, the identity of a person is determined by culture. And this pen is drying out, maybe I'll use a different one. Okay. Identity is determined by culture, but identity also feeds into culture. It shouldn't be up and down, it should probably be like this. They both feed into each other. Culture determines who we are, but we determine what the culture is. My identity, my perceived identity will determine what culture I am in. And when we talked about technology, we talked about how technology influences what we think of ourselves. We create multiple identities, we portray ourselves to be someone who we are not, and that leaves an impression on the mind of the receiver of our messages about who we are, and that in turn feeds back into our own perceptions of who we should be, and that changes us. So all that, again, these are complexities of communication. This is how communication affects us, and in turn affects what we send out into the environment, and in turn affects what is and can be considered right and appropriate and effective in the environment, and in turn impacts what the environment, especially in the international arena, considers as appropriate or effective or correct. So again, you know, it's a very complex kind of system where everything is, there's this big chaos and everything is sort of colliding against each other, and then everything that we are sending out is getting reactions from different sources. The reactions may be diametrically opposite and we have to deal with these reactions. Okay. Cultural identity and communication competence. How do we decide you know, where we draw the line, where we say we are competent? How does culture impact the communication, how competent we are perceived to be as communicators? In the 6th session, we discussed what culture is. We discussed the definitions of culture. We discussed the determinants of culture. We also discussed the socio-ideological differences between cultures. We talked about individualism, collectivism. We talked about goal orientation. We talked about a whole bunch of things, and I'm going to refer to some slides. I'm not going to show you those slides. I request that you go back to these lectures, but I'm going to read from the previous slides for your benefit. And so we talked about the socio-ideological differences between cultures. We talked about specific and diffuse boundaries. We talked about universalism and particularism. We talked about affective and neutral aspects of culture or ideologies. We talked about the status. We talked about nature, how we treat nature as in different cultures. We talked about gender equality, power distance, uncertainty avoidance, individualism, collectivism, masculinity, femininity, Confucian dynamism, long-term versus short-term goals. So we talked about all of these different things. We also talked about difficulties with diversity. We talked about how diversity can create difficulties for us. In the international business environment, we have diverse people. We have people coming from very different ideologies, very different backgrounds, very different expectations from their environment, and how these expectations can impact how we communicate with them. We also talked about culture clash as an important determinant of or as an important element of intercultural or international communication. We said that a culture clash is a conflict over basic values that occurs among individuals from different cultures. Again, just a revision because we've not used this term very much, so I am just repeating it. And we also discussed the reasons for culture clashes. In the 7th and 8th sessions, we talked about intercultural communication. We talked about high and low context cultures. We talked about cultural frameworks. We talked about institutional distance. We talked about the connection of contextuality of cultures with Berlow's SMCR model. We also discussed the application of intercultural communication to corporate interactions and different industries. Just a revision, high and low context cultures essentially are termed as high and low because of the importance that is placed on the context in the culture. In a high context culture, the culture is considered to be, or the context is considered to be more important than goal achievement. The premise is that if we take care or if we ensure equilibrium within the context, the system itself will be in equilibrium. If we ensure if we focus on the equilibrium within the context, the goals will take care of themselves. We just need to be comfortable with each other. We need to make sure that there are no conflicts. We need to make sure nobody's public image is affected. We need to make sure that people are as comfortable with each other being a part of a system as possible, and if we do that, then the achievement of their goals will automatically happen. In a low context culture, lower emphasis is placed on culture. Again, this is something that on context. We say that goals are more important, or achievement of goals is more important than maintaining an equilibrium within the context, than maintaining harmony within the context. If the premise is that if we achieve our own individual goals as well as possible, then the context will come to a state of harmony on its own. We don't really need to worry too much about it. If we all do our work individually, if we all give it our best shot, the environment will take care of itself. Again, nothing is right or wrong, and one of my students in one classes said, ma'am, why high and low? High culture and low culture. It is not high and low. One is not superior to the other. It's just high emphasis on context, low emphasis on context. That's how, I just wanted to clarify that because it has come up. It's not high and low culture. It is high emphasis on context culture, low emphasis on context culture. But low emphasis on context means high emphasis on goal achievement. So please remember this, and this will become crystal clear to you. Okay. Session 9, we discussed thought and speech, and we discussed ethno-cognitivism, we discussed problem solving, and we discussed hemisphericity. We discussed different cognitive styles, and I gave you all this input because what you think, the way your brain processes the information has a bearing on what you speak. It may not be very obvious to you, but if you look at patients or people who've had a stroke or some injury to their brain, at that point all this becomes very visible. I personally know someone who has had a stroke, whose brain is processing the information the way it should, but unfortunately the speech apparatus is not obeying the signals that are being sent to it from the brain. So unfortunately this gentleman cannot speak, but this gentleman can process all the information as accurately as he could before the unfortunate happening. So again, so that is why I thought I should bring this to your notice. The way our brain processes the information is just as important as learning about what goes into speaking. Once we learn these processes in the brain, it becomes very easy for us to understand the rest of it, the rest of the communication process. And that's why we talked about cognitive styles, we talked about field dependence and independence, we talked about reflectivity and impulsivity, we talked about tolerance and intolerance of ambiguity, we talked about left and right hemisphere of the brain doing different things. We also discussed the influence of cognitive styles on behaviors in different cultures, and again the style that we use to process information, to make sense of our worlds, has a bearing on and is to some extent derived from the culture that we socialize in from the time that we are born. We also discussed the cultural differences in problem solving. Focus on the screen please. Thank you. We discussed cultural and situational variations in patterns of thought. In the 10th session, we again revised the cultural differences in problem solving. We revised the cultural and situational variants in patterns of thought. We also discussed ethno-cognitivism and hemisphericity in greater detail. We discussed the styles of learning and problem solving and their hemispheric preference, and we discussed the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. In the 11th session, we discussed translation as a problematic discourse. We discussed what happens when we, in multilingual societies, we discussed multicultural organizations, we discussed how translation changes the meanings of interpretations, and we discussed the impact of multiple ideologies, beliefs and interests in the interpretations in different languages and translation, and that really creates a problem in organizations. We discussed coincident meanings. We discussed the, focus on the screen please, thank you, coordination of comfort zones in organizations. We discussed the degradation of coincident meanings. We also discussed translation and coincident meanings and the degradation of coincident meanings as a result of translation. Coincident meanings are meanings that are generated together. We also call it the coordinated management of meaning or the social construction of meaning. And we discussed this in the 11th session, and we discussed the problems posed by translation in multilingual organizations, specifically in multilingual organizations, which are multilingualism is a characteristic feature of international organizations, which is how this lecture tied in with the essence of this class on international business communication. In the 12th session, we talked about a very interesting topic. We talked about non-verbal communication. We discussed the definition, characteristics and processes of non-verbal communication. We discussed non-verbal behavior and non-verbal communication, the differences between the two. We discussed the non-verbal encoding and decoding skills, how we perceive different people doing different things. We discussed the goals of non-verbal communication, why do we communicate non-verbally. We discussed the differences between verbal and non-verbal messages. We discussed how non-verbal behaviors support verbal behaviors, what do they do, how they sort of add on to verbal behaviors. We discussed the different modalities. We discussed body codes, we discussed contact codes, and we discussed the spatio-temporal codes, how we interpret these or how we express ourselves non-verbally through the way we use our body, through the way we touch people, or through the way in which we treat our space, between us and around us, and what we carry on our person and all of those things, and how we treat time. Temporal refers to time, so how we treat time also comes into this. So how do we express ourselves, and what kind of an impression does this give to the people listening to us or trying to make sense of what we are saying. We discussed the management of non-verbal expressions. We also discussed the implications of non-verbal behavior in the workplace and the management of emotional expression in the workplace. In the 13th and 14th sessions, we discussed in great detail the barriers to communication, the stumbling blocks to intercultural communication, and the barriers to communication, which could be physical, which could be psychological, semantic, which deals with the meanings of words. We discussed in great detail the organizational barriers and cures to organizational barriers in communication. We also discussed the social barriers and the barriers related to the medium of transmission of messages. In sessions 15 and 16, we discussed listening. We discussed the difference between hearing and listening. We talked about why people listen. We discussed why the different types, levels and stages of listening. We discussed the barriers to listening, the implications for managers in the current business environment, effective and ineffective listening, the strategies for listening, and feedback as an application of listening. Feedback is a very, very important aspect of management. Feedback really defines good and, it makes the difference between good and bad management, because we are always dealing with people, and people need to be need some inputs on what they're doing right and what they're not doing right. And so we discussed feedback as an application of listening in the international business environment. In the 17th session, we discussed communication rules. We talked about dyadic communication, the communication between two different people, the complementary and symmetrical interaction, where the interaction becomes senior to junior, and how the interaction becomes sort of one-on-one, as we say. So we discussed pragmatic rules. We discussed content rules. Pragmatic rules was the portion where we talked about the example of that pretty girl who was told, or this seems to be some problem with the computer. Okay, anyway, I'll take care of this. Okay, so when we talked about pragmatic rules, that was the point where we discussed the example of this pretty girl whose boss tells her that she's looking pretty today, and all that confusion that happens because of how she interprets all that. So we discussed procedural rules, we discussed content rules, we discussed the communication rule topics, we discussed how conversations begin and end, who decides what to say, when to say it, when to withdraw, when to end the conversation, how to deal with outside interruptions and all of that stuff. We also discussed the co-orientation model of communication rules. We discussed the accuracy and agreement on communication rules. We also discussed some bit about the popular opinion regarding communication rules and the reasons for following communication rules in a professional environment. In the 20th session, we talked about communication styles. We talked about communicative dispositions. We talked about communication accommodation theory. We talked about the dimensions of communication. We talked about the styles of communication, different styles people follow. We talked about verbal styles. We talked about categories of communication styles. We also talked about communication styles as manifestations of personality. How do you get an idea of how the person will behave? Are they predictive in nature? Probably, maybe they are. We discussed all that. We also discussed the factors affecting communication styles. In the 19th and 20th session, I'm sorry, I think I made a mistake here, 17, 18. This should be session 18. Let me just change this. I think I made a mistake there. This should have been session 18. Session 18 was communication styles. There's just too much, and that is why I'm trying to sort of go through it session by session. Sessions 19 and 20 were interpersonal communication, where we discussed interpersonal processes of assimilation. We talked about what it means to be communicating with somebody else. We talked about how when you go into a new organization, what happens when you reach a new organization. We talked about assimilation. We talked about factors affecting organizational socialization. We talked about the socialization process. We talked about the superior subordinate communication as one of the first relationships that is formed or the first kind of communication that occurs when you join a new organization. We also discussed the information exchange between co-workers. We talked about implications of co-worker relationships. We talked about how co-worker relationships can be positive, negative, how friendships can affect co-worker relationships. We discussed the strains co-worker relationships and friendships pose on people. We discussed organizational acculturation. How do you become a part of the organization? We discussed gossip. We discussed what it means to be, the gossip, grapevine, all of that stuff, and the benefits of gossip to some extent. We also discussed organizational recognition. How do organizations recognize their employees? How do employees feel involved in the organizations that they are a part of? We discussed how people negotiate their roles in any organization. We also talked about job competency and how one starts feeling competent because of the messages that one receives in any environment. We discussed emotion management. We discussed power and control. How do you decide who is really the boss and who's not, and how do you exercise and express control? Excuse me. In the 21st and 22nd sessions, we talked about relational communication. We discussed how relationships are formed. We discussed the stages of relationships and the impact of context, perceptions, and communication rules on the formation of relationships and the stages of relationships. There's some sound again outside. I'm sorry about that. We also discussed the development and analysis of relationships. And there's some disturbance outside, or probably coming from the television, I'm not sure. Anyway, we discussed the development and analysis of relationships. We discussed theoretical explanations. I gave you a whole bunch of painful theory. Please focus on the screen. Thank you. Okay. Theoretical explanations. We talked about the social exchange theory. We talked about American pragmatism. We talked about fundamental interpersonal relations orientation theory, FIRO theory. We talked about relational interactional theory. We talked about interpersonal perception theory. We talked about rules theory. We talked about coordinated management of meaning theory. We talked about ethnomethodology, dialectical theories, dialogic theories, and dramaturgical theories. And we discussed a whole bunch of things that are really relevant to how communication takes place between different people or between co-workers in the professional environment. Now, as we go along, I would like you to go through these slides one by one. I mean, this is just a very, very concise summary of what we have covered in every lecture, and sometimes on occasion, like this slide, I put the summary of 2 sessions on one slide. So I would like you to start thinking about the applications of each of these, even though I have mentioned those on your in the lecture itself, and I'll give you some more questions, some more pointed questions alongside that you can refer to. So please think of practical applications of these things. These theories haven't come out of thin air. They have come out of real life situations that were observed by people who were interested in understanding these situations more, and who were interested in analyzing these situations. Sessions 23 and 24 discussed organizational communication, the role of communication in organizational development. Theoretical underpinnings were classical management theories. We discussed the systems based theorizing, we discussed discourse based theorizing. We also discussed the communicative organization model here, in which I will pull it up and I will give you some inputs. Again, I am not going to focus on my own computer, but I will give you the things that we talked about here. This is sessions 23 and 24. Okay, organizational communication. All right, hopefully I will be able to pull it up. Not able to find it here now. Yeah. Okay, we talked about the communicative organization model, where we discussed how you anticipate in a communicative organization, we anticipate misunderstandings, we have social interactions, we have behavioral flexibility, and we have strategic communication planning. And again, you know, this was from this book by Modaf and Devine. In most cases, I've shown you the books I've referred to. I've brought one more book that I'll show you at the end of this class that I've just received from the publisher, and that you know, I can suggest that you, I mean, you know, if you want a good concise book on business communication, I can show you that book. Anyway, in session 25, we talked about collaboration, we talked about communicative climates, defensive, and just a second, I'll pull it up and then we will talk about this in 1 second. Okay. Okay, we talked about communication climates, we talked about the process of collaboration, we talked about the components of collaborative design, and we talked about global teams. In this, we have supportive climate and we have the defensive communication climate. That supportive climate aids in collaboration, and defensive climate usually results in conflict and low morale and low motivation, and that can really break the cohesiveness in any organization. And we talked about how global teams are formed. In sessions 26 and 27, we talked exclusively about groups. We started with a discussion on differences between groups and teams. We talked about the significance of studying group behavior and communication. We discussed the elements and concepts of group behavior. We discussed reasons for the formation of groups. We discussed group characteristics. We discussed individualistic and collectivist assumptions in group formation, indirectly talking about high and low context cultures. So, high context cultures are collectivist in nature, low context cultures are individualistic in nature. What happens when you have a group that contains a mixture of or a you know, few people from the individualist culture and few people from the collectivist culture, and what will happen? So, I want you to think about those possibilities, observe these things in your environments. We discussed group functions and roles. We talked about understanding the group as a system. We talked about work group typologies, defensive and non-defensive work groups. We talked about cultures of workplace groups. We talked about stages of group development. We talked about group effectiveness and group conformity. We also discussed relational communication in groups, and we talked about dysfunctional groups and what dysfunctional groups can mean and what they can do to an organization or a team. And then in sessions 27 and 28 we discussed teams. We again discussed the differences between groups and teams. We talked about different kinds of teams that are there. We talked about different types of teams that are there. We talked about the nature of teamwork, what it means to be working in a team. We talked about team building and how teams can be built. We talked about the norms of team behavior. We also discussed the significance and types of norms. And again, I went into so much detail because all this has a bearing on how you perceive your environments. We discussed the norms that foster competent group interaction. We also discussed communication networks. We discussed maintenance communication. We discussed the maximization and minimization of power differences and the reasons for doing so and how they affect the communication climate in an organization. We discussed the development of professional relationships and the consequences of work relationships. What strains they pose, how they are perceived, how they affect the communication in any organization. We also discussed roles and role dynamics. We discussed role conflict. We discussed demographic fault lines and team performance, and we talked about high performance teams. In sessions 29 and 30 we talked about compliance and persuasion. We discussed what it means to persuade people. Why do people agree to listen to us? We talked about different theories as always. We discussed the classical rhetorical theory. We discussed artistic and inartistic persuasive appeals, and we discussed interpersonal traditions. We also talked about the components of persuasion, the process of persuasion, the assumptions and goals of persuasion, the persuasion and the structure of messages, how structure of messages affects persuasion, and we talked about the tools of persuasion. We discussed the structure of a persuasive message. We also talked about source credibility, how do you assess whether the source is credible or not, and persuasion schema, which is really what you think about the whole persuasion event. We also talked in these sessions about compliance and persuasion. About compliance, we talked about persuasion and we talked about compliance, and compliance essentially is why do people agree to listen to what you're saying? Why do people agree to do things you ask them to do? We talked about the compliance gaining theory, adaptation level theory. We discussed the reasons for compliance. We discussed mutual persuasion theory. We discussed the different strategies that can be used to gain compliance. We also discussed the impact of culture on compliance and vice versa. Not vice versa, I mean culture does influence compliance. We also discussed the compliance resisting tactics, and then we moved on to negotiation. We actually took the compliance resisting tactics to the class on negotiation, and we discussed what negotiation is and why do people negotiate, what are the elements of negotiation, what are the concepts in negotiation, BATNA, ZOPA, best alternatives to a negotiated agreement, zone of possible agreements, the reservation price, all of those things we talked about. We talked about the dimensions of negotiation. We talked about the stages in the negotiation process. How do you prepare yourself for a negotiation event? We talked about the rules of principled negotiation. How should you do it stage by stage? And this is where I started becoming prescriptive. This is where I started giving you some tips on what you should and should not be doing. So we talked about the factors affecting negotiations. We talked about the different types of negotiations: integrative, which is a collaborative negotiation where it's a win-win negotiation; distributive is a competitive negotiation where one party wins and the other loses. We talked about negotiation tactics, which should not be used as far as possible, but again there are hard tactics, there are soft tactics. We talked about culture and negotiations. how culture impacts negotiations and the tactics or the strategies we use for negotiation in different cultures. We also discussed effective negotiations and what it means to be an effective negotiator. In the 32nd session, we talked about management of conflicts. What is a conflict situation? How does conflict come up? Antecedent conditions, perceived and felt conflict. And again, as I told you in the 38th lecture, when we were talking about crisis communication, that model of conflict is really universally applicable to pretty much any organizational behavior communication situation. You know, how does conflict come up? You have some antecedent conditions. There's a perception, there's a feeling that leads to manifestation, behaviors. Then there is a resolution, aftermath. You try and resolve it, you try and act on it, and sort of if you resolve it, there is an aftermath. If you don't resolve it, there's another aftermath, and that sort of feeds in. So we talked about that. We talked about types and sources of conflict. Where does conflict come up from? Why do you get into a conflict situation in the first place? We discussed levels of conflict, various levels, hierarchical levels, also where does conflict start in any organization. We discussed what managers feel about conflict, what do they assume about any conflict situation. We discussed the conflict episode, you know, what the episode is really, what the reasons for conflict could be. We discussed the factors influencing the outcome of a conflict. How do we know that a conflict has been functional or dysfunctional? We discussed the individual attitudes to conflict. We discussed intercultural perceptions or inputs about conflict and conflict resolution, and we discussed approaches to conflict resolution. In the 33rd session, we talked about leadership and what, why and how of leadership. We discussed authority and power. We discussed leadership styles and impact on subordinates. We discussed communication as a determinant of leadership. We also discussed humor and supervisor-subordinate relationships. We discussed culture and leadership, the impact of culture on leadership. We discussed humor and supervisor-subordinate relationships. We discussed what impact, you know, where would you bring in humor and how humor would impact supervisor-subordinate relationships, how it plays, you know, up or down. We discussed culture and leadership. We discussed how culture impacts leadership, the leadership style that people have. We also talked about effective leaders, and we discussed, there was some philosophical advice regarding effective and practical leadership and what should you really do in different situations. In the 34th session, we talked about written communication. We discussed the differences between written and oral communication. There is one thing I missed, and as I was going through these slides, and again, you know, as much as we plan, we all tend to falter. There's one thing I missed, and that was the difference between oral, verbal and non-verbal communication and written communication. And I think I covered it briefly in the first session. I'm going to repeat it for your benefit now. Oral communication is the communication you have by using your vocal cords. So when this moves, that is oral communication. Verbal is when you use words. Non-verbal is when you don't use words. So technically, written communication is also verbal communication. And so, you know, when we talk about written communication, we talked about the significance of written communication. Why is it important? Why would you use written communication in any organization? We also talked about writing styles. We discussed the different writing styles, flowery or rhetorical, redundant, all of those things. We discussed the common problems with written messages. We discussed challenges to written messages. We also discussed some international differences. I gave you the example of United States and Mexico. Mexico is a high context area, and the focus there is on really building a rapport with the reader of the message. It's not as much on reaching the point, and it's about starting the message with a rapport building statement and ending the message with a rapport building statement. So we discussed communicative differences, communicative purposes of written messages, how written communication really helps you communicate, the communicative purposes of written messages. We talked about the writing process. You start with a goal in mind, the purpose, all of that stuff. We talked about good writing, clarity and precision, how you differentiate between good and bad writing. Focus on the thing, please. Thank you. And then we moved on to the role of technology, and again I had thought initially that I would give you some inputs on email and blogging and this and that, and then I realized that that is all that information changes from day to day. So what I would really like you to do at this stage is devise your own strategies or devise your own list of do's and don'ts for email and blogging and website building and communication via the telephone and internet and all of those things. And so we talked about the role of technology. I wanted to give you some more philosophical insights into technology use and context, and how context affects the use of technology, and how technology use in turn changes the context. And what really happens is what we discussed. I mean, the cyclical processes are so much a part of any form of human behavior. Everything just feeds into itself. So what happens is technology and context, use of and development of technology. This should be read as this, not technology of development. Development of technology depends on the context, and the context in turn determines these things. The context in turn determines the use of technology. It also determines the manner in which technology is developed. So we talked about communication technologies in the international business environment. We talked about computer mediated communication. We discussed how communication can be mediated through the use of technologies like the computer. We talked about human and human technology interaction, and the specific things or specific attributes of face-to-face human communication, and what the benefits they give us in comparison to the benefits or the attributes of human technology interaction. In the 36th session, we discussed something very interesting. We discussed moving to another culture. We again revised the stumbling blocks in intercultural communication. We discussed reasons for stumbling blocks. We discussed the sources of difference. Once again, we talked about migrant groups. We discussed voluntary and involuntary migrant groups. Voluntary groups are people that go on their own, so you may go for study, tourism, work, etc. Involuntary groups are those groups that are forced out of their homes because of civil unrest, human trafficking, kidnapping. Again, I would somehow, kidnapping is of course a worse form, but I would consider a okay, I am blank now. Anyway, I would consider adoption also as a form of involuntary migration, though it has a positive connotation. Children are adopted from different cultures when they are babies, and that's good, but it's involuntary. Usually the child doesn't have any knowledge or any idea or any understanding of the fact that this child is moving from one cultural context to another. Faint memories of where the child was, and then they go back to their own culture when they're in their when they're adults and they have the resources to go back. That has also been happening, and that can be classified as involuntary migration. The only difference is that if this happens when the children are babies, it really has a positive connotation as opposed to the other forms of involuntary migration, and the child really doesn't suffer any culture shock. The child gets abundant love and affection and care, which is what the child really needs. So one could assume that it could be a form of voluntary migration if the child had enough knowledge of what the child was in for. Anyway, so we talked about migrant host relationships, assimilation, integration, separation and marginalization. We talked about culture shock. We had talked about culture clash earlier. We talked about culture shock in this part, and culture shock really is the discomfort. The intensity of culture shock is really refers to the discomfort one feels between what one has, the culture or the context one has come from, to the culture one finds oneself in, and the difference between the comfort zones that one has and the expected comfort zones in this new host culture is really what gives the shock. And the shock is this difference. The intensity is proportional to the level of difference between the comfort, the qualitative and quantitative differences between the comfort zones and the expected comfort zones in the parent and host cultures. We talked about cultural adaptation and acculturation, how you assimilate, how you become a part of the culture. We also talked about intercultural communication. It shouldn't be intercultural communication, tourism and business. It should be in tourism and business. I'm sorry about that. Okay. We talked about intercultural communication in tourism and business. We talked about sojourners. We touched a little bit on the impact it has on identities. In the 37th session, we discussed re-entry. We discussed the W-curve theory of adaptation. We discussed what returnees offer their organization and why they go out and why they come back and all those things. We talked about successful adjustment upon return. We discussed the challenges to repatriation. Expatriation is going out, repatriation is coming back in. We talked about adjustment as a repatriate. We discussed expatriate failure and its impact on adjustment as a repatriate. We talked about stages in repatriation, and we discussed reverse culture shock and organizational support during repatriation. In the 38th session, we discussed crisis communication. We talked about crisis. We talked about the reasons for crises. We talked about models for crisis perception. A model of crisis perception, and how something goes from being a molehill to a mountain, and how we sense what the situation, how we perceive it to be a crisis. We talked about management of crises. We talked about contingency planning for crisis. We also talked about what happens during a crisis. We talked about culture and its impact on crisis and the perception of a crisis. We talked about crisis communication process and strategy. We also talked about effective communication in crises, and we talked about reputation management and image repair and the role of media and the do's and don'ts, and this is where I gave you some prescriptions. And in the previous session, which was the 39th session, we talked about communication ethics. We talked about theoretical considerations. We talked about the deontological approaches, the teleological approaches, the egalitarian approaches, and the theories of communication ethics, what it means to be an ethical communicator. We talked about ethical guidelines for communication. We talked about ethics in negotiations, deception, and unethical practices in written communication, and the implications of these unethical practices in written communication for intellectual property. We discussed plagiarism, etc. So I've tried to cover a whole bunch of things, and today I'll just give you some what we call as a guru mantra, or some bottom lines here for global managers to end this whole session. According to Adler and Bartholomew, 1992, in Alley and Camp, again this is from a paper which I happen to have with me. Global managers really understand the paper is called Global Managers Qualities for Effective Competition, and this is by Abbas Ali and Robert Camp. According to this, global managers understand the worldwide business. So if you are going to be a global manager, if you are aiming to be a global manager, You will understand the worldwide business environment from a global perspective. You will learn about many cultures. You will work with and learn from people from various cultures simultaneously. You will create a culturally synergistic organizational environment. You will learn to adapt to living in many foreign cultures, may not necessarily be many foreign countries, but different cultures. And if you are living in India, you will know what I am talking about. Living in different states really counts as living in different cultures. You will learn to use cross-cultural international skills or intercultural skills on a daily basis. Bottom line, the desired behavior competences for the international manager as outlined by Wills and Barham in Ali and Camp are cognitive complexity. You need to be cognitively complex, you need to have cultural empathy, you need to be able to listen actively, you need to have a sense of humility, accept difference as difference. That is what I've been saying throughout. You need to have the emotional energy, emotional self-awareness, emotional resilience, and risk acceptance. And as always, I forgot to close the bracket. I'm sorry about that. So you need to be aware of your emotions, you need to be able to bounce back, and you need to be able to accept risks, and you need to be psychologically mature. You should want to learn. There should be an inherent curiosity to learn. You should there should be an orientation to time, and there should be a personal morality, a sense of what is right and what is wrong, and that psychological maturity. And all of these things really essentially make you an international manager. And if you look at these things, none of these things is prescriptive. Please focus on the screen. Thank you. None of these things is, pinpointing, okay, increase the volume of your voice by so many decibels, or wear a sari that's black in color. None of that. This is more conceptual, and that is essentially what this course has been all about. And what I've not put a slide telling you that this is what you need to do. The last slide says thank you, but what I would really like you to do at this point is please go through these slides one by one and think of the applications of each of these scenarios in your own environments. How would you become an effective negotiator? Take all the technologies you have and decide which one would you use where. Take all the forms of written communication, write down the benefits of each. How do each of these play on the time taken, the quality of interpretation, ambiguity, all of those things, and evaluate these things and drop your own charts. And I expect you to do all this on your own, and my contact information should be there along with this course. So please get back to me with your suggestions and feedback. I look actively for those, and I have tried to give you all the references. The reason for not putting things in quotes is that this whole thing would be full of quotation marks. But wherever I have taken material from someone, I have put the names of those people on the same slide, preferably next to the concept that has been taken from somebody that has been referred to. So I will give you a list of references, questions and answers, and I look forward to your feedback and suggestions, and wish you all the best with this course and with your learning from other courses through the National Program on Technology Enhanced Learning. Wish you all the best.